Before we go forward, let's take a step back. A couple videos ago, we went over direct objects and you saw how to use direct object pronouns. Remember? I buy food is compro comida. Comida is the direct object because it gets the action of the verb, which is buy or comprar. The direct object usually answers the questions what or whom. So what do I buy? Food or comida. But I can also say I buy it or la compro. It, or in this case, la, is the direct object pronoun. What always trips me up is you have to put the direct object pronoun before the conjugated verb. A little tricky. It's like talking backwards. If any of this doesn't make sense to you, you should really go back and watch the video direct object pronouns, because in this video we're going to continue down that same path. In English, there's really not much else to teach with this because direct object pronouns are exactly the same as indirect object pronouns. But in Spanish, that just isn't so. What that means in reality for you is you have to choose the right one. But don't worry, it's not that hard. And when you're done with this video, not only will you know how to use indirect object pronouns and how they're different from direct object pronouns, but if you're anything like me, you'll even know English a little better. At the very beginning of this video, I said direct objects usually answer the questions what or whom. I buy food. What do I buy? Food. Well, indirect objects usually answer the questions to whom or for whom pertaining to the direct object. So I buy you food. For whom do I buy the food? For you. You is the indirect object, and in this case, already an indirect object pronoun. Here's the chart of all the indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Do they look familiar? They should. Except for the third row here, they're exactly the same as the direct object pronouns you already learned. I buy you food would be te compro comida. Notice the placement of te before the conjugated verb. This is just like direct object pronouns. It's tricky, but if you've already practiced, this will be no harder. As always though, it's the third row here that really messes everything up. As you see, it's just plain different. With direct object pronouns, him is masculine and her is feminine. Him is lo and her is la. But with indirect object pronouns, him and her are both le. It works the same on the plural side. So I love him would be lo amo. I love her would be la amo. But I buy him the food would be le compro la comida. And I buy her the food would also be le compro la comida. See how this can get a little confusing? So in Spanish, it's important you can identify the direct object and the indirect object in a sentence because sometimes which pronoun you use will depend on it. Let's practice this in English quickly to get used to it before we see it in Spanish. Manuel tells me a story. A story is the direct object. It answers the question, what? What does Manuel tell? Then me is the indirect object pronoun. It answers the question, to whom? To whom does Manuel tell a story? Here's another one. He sells her the phone. The phone is the direct object. Her is the indirect object pronoun. I bought you a present. A present is the direct object in this one, and you is the indirect object pronoun. Got this? Asking those questions, what or whom, then to whom or for whom, really does work. Now, since indirect objects are basically where the direct object is going, it's safe to say you can't have an indirect object or indirect object pronoun without a direct object. But what about this sentence? He writes me every week. Él me escribe cada semana. To whom does he write? To me. So me is the indirect object pronoun. But what does he write? Every week? That's not right. But there's nothing else, no other words, and you can't have an indirect object without a direct object. What's going on here? He didn't write me literally, like write on me, or maybe trace an outline of me. You have to look into the meaning of the sentence, not just the words. He wrote a letter to me, or a postcard, or maybe a poem. I don't know. The direct object is implied. It exists, it's just implied. Simply talking about this makes it more complicated than it really is. All that's important is you use the correct word at the correct time. Lo, la, los, and las for direct objects, and len, les for indirect objects. But this idea of an implied direct object, this will come into play in the future several times. So it really does help to at least understand the theory. Then just move on. Another example. He tells me. He tells me what? The sentence doesn't say, but you can't tell nothing, so it's something. The answer? A secret? It has to be something. Then to whom does he tell? He tells me. Me is the indirect object pronoun and the direct object is implied. Okay, let's move on. All the examples you've seen so far have involved only one verb. And when there's only one verb, the indirect object pronoun always goes before the verb, just like direct object pronouns. But when there's two verbs in a sentence, also just like direct object pronouns, you can put the indirect object pronoun before the conjugated verb or attach it to the end of the not conjugated verb or the infinitive. So I want to tell you something could be te quiero decir algo, or it can be quiero decirte algo. We haven't talked about that word, but decir can be to say say or to tell. Both are very common. That's why you'll often hear the very cute mistake from a Spanish speaker learning English. I want to say you something, or I told to him. Next time you think you sound like a complete idiot when you make a mistake, think about how cute they sound when they make a mistake. You're fine. Just get out there and say stuff. Okay, let's talk redundancy. Often you'll see an indirect object pronoun even when the indirect object is used. That's weird. I thought indirect object pronouns replaced indirect objects. They do, but there are two good reasons to use both at the same time. Number one, clarity. The third person is very ambiguous. Le can mean him, her, or you formal, so it's nice to clarify. Le escribo. That could be I write him, I write her, or I write you formal. To make it very clear to whom I write, I could say le escribo a Manuel or le escribo a él. In both those sentences, le is the indirect object pronoun, but Manuel and a él are the indirect objects basically. So you'll often see both the indirect object and indirect object pronoun used in the third person to avoid ambiguity, to make it very clear what's being done to whom. The second reason you would use both is to add emphasis. This is more of a feeling. Memorize the rule for sure, but once you see it and hear it, and even better, use it a few times, this will really become instinctive. He loves me. Él me ama. But he loves me? Like you're fighting with somebody over who he loves more and you want to emphasize the me? It would be better to say él me ama a mí. The a mí at the end doesn't add any extra meaning. It means to me, and we already know that from the me, but the a mí at the end, it just adds emphasis. I really want to give you an example right now of the most common use of this, but I can't, not yet. You don't know the main words in the sentence, and I don't want to confuse you.